In the mid-'80s, I attended an all-girls Catholic preparatory school in Washington, D.C. Safety, both corporeal and spiritual, was the nuns' #1 priority. Nothing was going to happen to any of the girls on their watch. Every morning after we arrived, the security guard we had nicknamed Gollum locked the wrought iron gate with an enormous key that hung from a thick rope around his neck. Then he hobbled with his skeleton head cane back to his security post, a small brick building in the middle of the parking lot, where he watched various sporting events until the end of the day, when it was time to set us free. If it had not been for his German shepherd, Rolf, he would never have noticed when we made a break for it. Despite the nuns' vigilance, by sophomore year, most of the girls in my class were schooled in the romantic arts. The ones who said they had gone all the way were the same girls who knew how to apply makeup and arrived at school Madonna chic, striding down the corridors in alluring, scornful packs. During study hall, they offered tutorials, and the rest of us, naive and mortified by it, listened with rapt attention. Decades passed before I realized the fact that they omitted the more diabolical encounters probably meant that despite their sophisticated veneers, they were every bit as unschooled as me. I was young for my grade. The fall of my junior year, I was still 15. My parents were battling at that point, effectively separated. They refused to get divorced for religious reasons. But my mother had opened a travel agency, and she told everyone that field work set her apart from the competition. Her numerous trips meant that she was gone about 20 weeks out of every year. My father spent the nights when she was in town, living in a guest room at Congressional Country Club way out in Maryland. When she was out in the field, he moved back home to take care of me. The Exorcist was shown on television the first year of my parents' new living arrangement. My father was home that evening, and we watched it together in our small wood-paneled study, with my father's solitary Duraflame log blazing in the fireplace. I'd grown up with a Catholic fear of the devil, but I had no idea that he could just decide to lodge inside a person against her will. It sounds melodramatic to say it, but nevertheless it's true. That movie changed the trajectory of my life.
I called my wife, Terry, to tell her the car had conked out on the road to Hogback Ridge. "Serves you right," she said. Then she hung up on me. It sounds harsh, but she had a point. I should have given up on this clunker long ago. My Volvo 240 is nearly 15 years old, and I had been trying to hold on until I hit the 300-mile mark. I'd replaced the fuel pump the week before, but clearly that wasn't the problem. Suddenly on Route 307, the car was refusing to go faster than 10 miles per hour. Not good to coast to a stop on a rural road out by Hogback Ridge State Park, but better than zeroing out in the middle of the highway, I figured. Terry just bought a new car for herself, and I admit I was holding it against her, refusing to replace mine because she'd acted so imprudently. The Lexus was way beyond our means, especially if we planned to retire in 7 years, as we had discussed ad infinitum. My son, David, 15, was beside me in the passenger seat, earbuds in 24/7. Let's just say he was there, but not there. This fishing trip was a means of luring him back, no pun intended. When he was younger, Hogback Ridge had always been one of our favorite destinations. 414 acres bordered on the north by the Grand River and the south by Mill Creek. The Grand is home to more than 70 species of fish. Plus, the river is bounded on one side by a high, narrow ridge, which in the winter clearly resembles the bony spine of a hog. And in the early spring, when the steelhead are running, is overlaid with delicate white bloodroot and spring beauty flowers. I decided to try to coast downhill into the parking lot. Because of the slight decline, we were cruising at a cool 10 miles per hour when I looked in the rear view mirror and saw a black pickup truck barreling down the road at 80 to 90 miles an hour. I turned my wheel toward the side of the road and the entrance to the long-abandoned Thunder Bay golf course, though there was no way I could make it out of his way in time. My only hope was that he would see me and slam on the brakes, which he did. He came to a stop about 2 feet before impact. Before I could even release my grip on the wheel, he screeched out into the other lane and pulled up alongside me. I rolled down the window. The driver was a teenager with light blue, red-rimmed eyes, a shaved head, a nose ring, and earrings that ran like ladder rungs up and down his earlobes. He scowled at me, and I noticed his right front incisor was missing and the rest of his teeth were dung brown.
Welcome back to the second annual Author Fair hosted by the Rochester Hills Public Library. And for Rochester writers, my name is Michael Dwyer. Joining us from the library is Tiffany Dzierman-Stozicki, and our author today for this segment is Kelly Fordon. Kelly, good to see you.
Nice to see you too.
And Tiffany, good to see you this morning.
Good to see you all too.
So we just heard a couple, I think, actors reading your work. Can you tell us about that, Kelly?
Sure. So in the spring, I have a friend who was an actor in New York, and a lot of people weren't working then, and so they had a little bit of extra time. So she had two friends who were voiceover artists, and so they recorded little clips of two of the stories. The first story, The Devil's Proof, is about a woman looking back at her high school years and something that happened during high school and trying to come to terms with that. And so that's The Devil's Proof. And then the second one is called Superman at Hogback Ridge. And it's about a man who goes fishing with his son, and they encounter, their car breaks down, and they encounter this meth addict who's like pretty dangerous. And the father has always had these doubts about his son. He doesn't know, his son plays a ton of video games like any high school kid. And so he's like, what is my son all about? And the son really shows him a side of himself that the father could be proud of. So that's kind of the upshot.
Well, that sounds nice. So this is from a collection of stories. And which book is that?
So it's called I Have the Answer. It just came out in April 2020 from Wayne State University Press, and it's one of 13 stories in the book. I mean, there are two of 13 stories.
Excellent. Yeah, I thought it was your new one. And so what's it been like for you releasing a book this year?
Well, it's been really tough, actually. I was lucky to have met a lot of people online, and writers are always on the computer. So I had a little bit of an online network, but, we had events scheduled at Page's Bookshop and at the local library in my town. So it was, a little bit disappointing. I had to work a little bit harder. Wayne State University Press is doing well right now, but right before it came out, they were having some issues too. So it was not the greatest year to release a book. On the other hand, a lot of people had nothing better to do than read for a while. So if you could concentrate, there were some people reading, which was nice. So it's just 2020 has been quite a year.
And I want to tell everyone that's listening today that Kelly and I go back quite a ways with working together on several projects and contests. And thank you for being a judge in many of those. And you're quite active with Springfed Arts, but I'm assuming not very much as well this year.
Well, we moved the classes online. So I've been teaching a couple of poetry classes online. And at first we started out, we were in Royal Oak for a while, and nobody really wanted to move online. But then when it became clear this was not going to end anytime soon, they made a really great transition to Zoom, and it's worked well. I mean, makes everybody feel like they can still be somewhat productive. You know, nice to see
Absolutely.
people.
Yeah, it's good to see people and to be able to connect one way or the other. And as authors, as writers, we're a bit reclusive many times of the year. And so social gatherings were a big deal. So it's important to still be able to do that.
Yeah, I know the conferences were a great way to, I mean, I loved going to the Rochester Writers Conference and seeing people there, but hopefully this time next year, we'll be able to do it in person again.
So how is the book doing right now, virtually and online?
I think it's doing, fairly well. I I think it's important to keep like pushing a little bit and keep trying to sell it. And libraries have been a big help. My library has been awesome, supporting it and putting on programs. But I don't think anybody's sales are quite what they would have been. It's hard to figure out what that model is. I mean, people are super supportive, but to actually get people to buy books is a little bit more difficult. But we keep trying. So.
Well, I'm sure it's opened up a different way to look at things. And have you discovered anything new with trying to market a book or release a book virtually or online or in a pandemic?
I'm trying to think. Well, for the first time, I used a publicist this time. And, you don't make that back. Let's just be honest. As a writer, like you never make that investment back in dollars. But what I was really trying to do was just sort of give the book a chance. I spent so many years on it. So I spent, a little bit on that. I tried not to spend much. I only paid for a couple months. But he did get me some interviews online. He helped me place a couple of the stories in, different journals. He was a great advocate for the book. And I think that it made it to some places it wouldn't have otherwise. Whether I think that was good for recognition, but whether that translates into actual sales is something I'm still not clear on. I had lofty goals, like I want to sell more than I sold on my first book. That is, not going to happen. I don't think that will happen at this point, but I gave it the old college try. And I think you just have to keep advocating for yourself and trying to figure out different avenues and reach out to people, which is not, as you know, like being introverts, that's not in my wheelhouse at all. I don't like that. But, I figured I spent 5 years writing a book. I have to treat it like I would a baby and take care of it and nurture it and show it off to people. So it's tough.
So
I
you're
don't know. And you
responsible
probably
for
know
it for
that.
at least 18 years.
Yeah. What have you heard about publicizing? I'm curious during this time.
Well, I mean, pretty much what you've said is we've looked at alternative methods of getting out there with Zoom calls and doing workshops, and many people held off, thinking that this is going to pass, and certainly this event here, Tiffany and I have been bantering about it all year, and the library made the call early on, and there was the correct call to do this virtually, and so we got it all set up, but I did not think that this would have to be an online event back in March.
No. Yeah, no one did. I don't think anyone thought it would go on this long.
No, and I think that we're going to be doing a lot of this throughout all of next year.
Mm-hmm. You do? You think it'll go
So,
on all year? You think it will?
Well, I guess it really depends. I mean, where I was optimistic before, I'm kind of pessimistic now. So if my pessimism, if I can say that word, proves not to be true and I'm surprised, then that's great.
Right. Yeah, I mean, I guess I would say one benefit has been going to all the Zoom readings of writers, outside of our Michigan area as well, who I've admired, who I, would never have made a reading before, just to find out about those online. I mean, you could fill up every day of the week, almost all day, going to readings, workshops, a lot of them offered for free. So I think that'll be a great way to get through the winter for sure.
Absolutely. Tiffany, do you have a question?
Just curious about your inspiration for writing poetry and if you have favorite poets that you've admired through your writing career.
Oh, yes. So I love Laura Kazishki's work. Are you familiar with her?
No, I'm not.
Okay, so she's at the University of Michigan. She's written about 10 different poetry books, and I love her work. I love Diane Zeus, who's working out of Kalamazoo. She's at Western Michigan, I think, but I love her poetry as well. I always write poems so I have this, like an overwhelming feeling. You probably have heard this from other poets. You have like an overwhelming feeling. I'm like, oh, I don't want to be really sentimental. I've got to find some images that will convey what I'm feeling here. So I just work on gathering all the images that might convey that feeling. And then it's separate from a story, because a story, you have like a character you want to follow and see what they're going to do, or a narrative arc that you want to pursue, or even, like a relationship in the real world that you want to transfer onto some characters and have them hash it out in the story in a different scenario. So I guess it's a different impulse. I actually have been writing a lot of poetry in the middle of the pandemic, when, how your mind, like my mind in particular, was not working that well. I was just sort of, the days were fading into each other, and I wasn't tracking that well. And so poetry is really useful for me then, just to read or to write during that time. Who are some of yours favorite poets?
I'm kind of the classics. Like I like Pablo Neruda and, just those types of imageries and the pictures and the things that come across just really, really mean something. Mm-hmm. They really kind of, when poetry really touches you, then that it's made an impact on you, right? It's
exactly, yeah.
Moment.
I was just talking to my high school book club. My high school friends had a book club, and then we were all Zooming last night, and then there were a couple of English teachers on the call, and I was like, oh my God, I was so awful at poetry, grammar, everything in high school, because I just, I didn't get that, let's scan the line, or, meter and whatever. And I think a lot of people are thrown off about thinking that it's sort of a drudgery or a job to read a poem, when it's just purely for enjoyment, connection, catharsis. So yeah. They were laughing. I am terrible at grammar. I'm never going to get a job at a university now saying that. Terrible.
Well, that's interesting,
Kelly,
because, I think a lot of people think that, writers have this mastery of certain parts of, English and writing. And sometimes it's just actually just sort of knowing how words go together, and it may not be that you have all of the grammatical rules down, nor do you need to have them necessarily.
Right.
If you have a skill and a talent to hear what
mm-hmm.
sounds, correct together and how it works. So I think that's inspirational in and of itself, because I think writing can be very intimidating to people. If they think that there's a sort of science behind it that they have to acknowledge and learn. But if you just start writing, it sometimes will just come naturally to you.
Yeah. And, if you enjoy it, you'll pursue it, you'll get better at it, you'll read more, you'll learn through osmosis. And even if you can't really describe what you're doing, I did hear one writer say, like, I'm a writer, not a scholar. I cannot deconstruct this sentence for you, but I wrote it, so I don't know what to tell you.
Oh, it's true.
Well, Kelly, that kind of segues into a question I have about poetry, reading poetry, and listening to poetry, both from the listener standpoint and from the author standpoint? Is it constructed differently when it's meant to be read out loud to an audience versus just read?
Well, I think that for poetry, people, if you're reading it, then you're working with line breaks. So you want people to follow the line breaks, and you're hoping to surprise them when the line break ends at a certain point. But I've often noticed with a lot of poets, when they read it, they're not stopping at the line break. They're reading it as you would read it in conversation. So they're not using it in the same way. So I think that's why it's a different experience often when you see the poem on the page and then you hear someone read it. You get a different flavor for the poem. I can't speak to slam poetry because I haven't done a lot of that, but I would assume that they're writing that with line breaks, where they can actually read it with the line break. So it's following that construction. But I think personally, I think a lot of poems, have to be written to read because you're not often with the poet when you're looking at it. So it has to work on the page. And a lot of people now are using, space to a great advantage, like making a big wide open space between two words to convey either that there's something unsayable in that space or unknowable, or, they're just using the page in really interesting ways, I guess, is the bottom line.
And I bet you that's something that we might be able to learn in one of your classes.
Yes. Yes. Yeah, we do. We work on that.
I want to remind everybody that we are speaking with author Kelly Fordon, and her book is I Have the Answer. I'm looking at my other screen. I Have the Answer, and hopefully sales will be great for this holiday season. If there's a place for people to go to find out more about you or your classes, or maybe to buy your book, I bet you can tell us where that is.
Sure. My website is www.kellyfordon.com, and that's KELLYFORDON. And you can find out, I have a blog as well. I don't deconstruct sentences, but we deconstruct stories on the blog. I talk to poets, and now this year I've been talking to short story writers, and it's called Let's Deconstruct a Story, where we really dive into the stories and try and figure out how they work. So I've just started doing that. So that's on the blog too.
Wonderful. Thank you so much for joining us today, Kelly and Tiffany from the library. We'll have another author coming up soon, right here on the 2020 Author Fair.